little bit of a groggy state. I think they
Hypnagogic.
hypnopompic or hypnagogic. There's two
Yeah.
words to describe
Right.
somewhat similar. That sort of half waking, half sleeping.
Yeah.
I find that that's a great time to write, particularly poetry,
Uh-huh.
because the rules that usually control our construction of language are kind
Right.
of loosened,
Right.
and maybe the
Yeah.
hemispheres kind of dance, your left and right kind of dance back and forth, and I
Right.
think more oftentimes I find that the things that fall out then construction, the words that you kind of put near each other maybe are somehow a little freer to be more about the emotional place that they're coming from rather than your rules of grammar,
Right.
and killing the sentence can be really the key to making a nice phrase or a nice.
Right.
So often, like things that, like the seeds of poems start there in
Uh-huh.
that place.
Right.
Like one I was working on recently, it's uh, it's all a poem all about rope, basically,
Mm-hmm.
and I can do the lover's tangle. I can do the hanged man's twitch. Those are two lines that kind of fell out,
Yeah.
and and then later I try to like to varying degrees of success try to build a poem around that. That
Right.
one's kind of come together as a thing called climbing around the middle,
Right.
which is not done, but it's kind of this idea of it's like a midlife crisis poem,
Right.
like you know trying to get to higher ground, but you're kind of at times just in that not necessarily mediocre, but it's often hard to know
Slightly
what's
dissatisfied
yeah, the
area.
dissatisfied place, which art gives us those few moments of divine dissatisfaction or something. But that's what that poem is intended to be about.
Yeah.
And some of the lines get it, and I shared it with my writing group the other night and got some good feedback, but also good places where the poem needs to grow.
Uh-huh. How do you
Yes.
like working with the group? Well, I guess you do. You've been doing it for a while.
Yeah, I have. It's very good. I think it's very helpful to know. Well, I find it very. I kind of know what I think is working, but it's often it's encouraged. There's sources of encouragement, but I think kind of to some extent. Well, that's a big part of it, but also I think to some extent to hear other people's work and to be able to talk about other people's work with people who are actively interested in talking about it,
Mm.
and I like that. I think that's probably the biggest value to hearing what other people are bringing in,
Uh-huh.
and then to hear, you know, I don't know. When you write, I know for me, relatively, I know what parts of the poem are the working parts and what parts aren't. So
Right.
it's not so much.
It can be as simple as that, can't it? Just it's either working or not.
I think so. Yeah, I think it's also important to kind of be easy on yourself, and that's not your really. The job isn't really to decide whether it's good. It's just
Right.
kind of it's kind of get out of the way and let it come out in a kind of with integrity, with sort of pre, a presentness. That's kind of the job, and you just know what's working. It's not about whether it's good or not. You just know whether you've been there or not been there,
Right.
and it's. I think at times you can tie yourself in knots trying to guess what people want to hear or whether it's good or
Yeah.
and I
Well, I guess that not tying, right? That becomes a different subject. Then you get to untie, right?
right. Uh-huh. There is I mean there's certain pieces that have definitely benefited by revisioning. I heard some famous poet.
It's an interesting phrase, revisioning.
Well, that's what I was just gonna say. That was some I forgot who it was. Might have been Lewis Simpson, maybe. He was a pretty successful poet. Um, said the word revisioning, revising, comes from revisioning, and just stick a hyphen between that re and the vision, and you kind of probably get the better approach to editing.
Right.
You know, try to get back to the place that engendered the poem,
Mm-hmm.
and
Right.
and newer things can fall out. I circling back to that whole idea of the morning time as a starting time. That is usually where I start stuff, but it's not typically where I edit stuff. I usually do that in the afternoons. And maybe that would be something to consider, really. Maybe doing some revising in the morning with that idea of it being a real revisiting of it or a revisioning of it. But I often move, and I do that by hand. I write by hand. Original first pass stuff is always actually with a fountain pen and in one particular book that I
So
like.
that's a whole big difference between
Computer.
using the computer, huh?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah.
In fact, what I like to do in my work is when I move it from the page to the computer, I like to be very true, just transcribe, not do any, except for maybe spelling errors or whatever,
Right.
or obvious the wrong word,
Yeah.
like there,
Yeah.
where I spelled it THERE instead of
Uh-huh.
THEIR. Uh, to to just transcribe it word for word.
Yeah.
But
So
no,
you
so
you
like get
like
that first pass
yeah.
down and then just work from that. And I like to keep every version. So when in the computer, I'll keep them as different pages.
Right.
In the case where the poem is one page or less, that works easily.
So you can come back to it
I
at some
often go
future
back, like,
date.
because sometimes the editing process through the course of like 18 versions, you know, you lose
18
track.
versions, that many.
Oh, certainly. Some of them. I mean, it's been said, poems are never finished, they're simply abandoned.
Right. And a good piece of work isn't made, it's remade.
Right, right. Well, there's certainly, in painters, you hear about these stories like, get down like
Well,
4 or 5 layers
I
of
have a
oil and,
painting that I've been working on for about 8 years.
right, there you go. And probably underneath there's, almost a completely different painting. The danger, I think, from over editing is that suddenly it can start to feel labored. You
Uh-huh.
lose the freshness of certain phrases in over tweaking it. And so there have been times when I've refound, I think, the valuable parts of a poem by looking back and, oh yeah, I lost that, and that
Mm-hmm.
belongs here.
Yeah.
And to some extent it's just, afraid to throw anything away,
Uh-huh.
so well, but I think one thing good about it is, like, so if you have a poem and you want to do some work on it, if you take it and you make a complete copy of the version that you're going to be revising, and you work with that copy, there's a certain degree of you don't have to worry about it,
Mm-hmm.
because you're working with a copy. So there's the liberation that so you're free. You're not
Right.
so worried about deleting a line or changing a phrase, because
Right.
when you're done, you look at it, and if you feel it's not right, the other one's still available.
Right.
But
Good
revising, I think,
idea.
is probably, thanks. Revising, I think, is probably the hardest. Well, for me, I think the hardest thing now is to kind of that the willingness to let things go, in the sense of like submitting them or presenting them or reading them out loud.
Uh-huh.
And I'm still that's still a difficult area.
It's a
I'm a relative
threshold,
beginner.
isn't it?
Yeah,
Reading them out loud.
certainly. It's become easier, hosting the open mic. I have, not that I don't think I abused that opportunity, but I have an opportunity to read anything I want, once a week, really, and uh, so I become more comfortable with reading them out loud. I think the threshold is more for me now, at least my personal process has put me into
Well, that's interesting because I went through an experience where I felt I lost my voice and I had to get back into being able to read. And I went
Uh-huh.
around to open mics where I
Right.
was just watching for a
Well, I
while.
think that's when we met.
Right.
Or maybe, I don't know if that's the period you're talking, but
No, that is.
yeah.
Yeah. And so I guess it is. I can see where that could be like a valuable place for you.
Definitely, and getting comfortable just being in front of people. I mean, I like doing it, and uh, it's funny because a lot of the Mondays I'll think, oh God, I wish I wasn't doing it tonight. But once it starts, I'm always enjoying it. I really am. But yeah, uh, it's been a very valuable place to just get at ease with reading. But still, I still get nervous reading my own work.
I find, too, something very interesting to me is with all the trouble that the world is having in different groups of people getting along,
Uh-huh.
I sort of admire what's going on with the poets because, I mean, they really exercise in their
Support
individuality to the extreme,
at the
but
same time as supporting each other.
right,
Yeah,
exactly. But at
yeah.
the same time, they're
Different
completely
voices.
supporting everyone else's
Right,
individuality.
right.
And that to me is like a
That's
rare
true.
occurrence.
That's nicely said. I mean, there's a few people that bend it because they're just there to hear themselves, but for the most part, I think that's definitely true. There's an appreciation. I mean, we get 40, 50 people, and only 15 or 20 are readers, so there's certainly people there just to listen, which is nice. And um, yeah.
Well, do you feel that then after you cross the threshold with a piece of work,
Hmm.
then is that it, or then can you bring it back into the writing cycle again?
Well, there's some pieces that maybe it's just because I need to kind of say, okay, I don't have to work on that one anymore. But I probably could say that everything, when I read it and I'm willing to allow myself to consider some change to it, that there's things that could grow. I mean, because when you really truly revisit the place, you come as a different person, so you're gonna have something else. If all that you have else is just the awareness of it,
That's
having come from you in the
something,
past.
yeah, that's a good point. I remember one of your open mics, Blue read a story of his experiences in LA.
Hopping freights
And
or which
no, this was just his homeless period in
right.
LA. And but he was reading it, or he was writing it as a different person,
Yeah,
as
yeah,
someone who had matured out of that
exactly.
perspective. Yeah.
Blue brings pretty nice work. He hasn't been in a while, but he brings pretty nice work.
So that is an interesting point of view, coming back to a that place as you
Right, I
describe it
think
with a different perspective.
I think in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Joyce, there's a whole section where Stephen goes off on just that point, in his sort of stream of anxiety kind of state of mind.
Right.
Just like, am I the same person I was the last moment, and how that
Right.
affects what I have to say. So I think I mean, as far as like works being finished, it's really by nature and to some extent impossible for them to be.
I think it
You just
was.
make the decision that was done then, and I'm done with it. But I think to some extent that's just a decision that you just make either because you have to, because it's too painful to go back, or you're just not going to go back for whatever reason. But if you're willing to go back, I think in some ways there's just more on the table. if only what's on the table is your having written that piece in the first place. I don't know, it sounds, maybe it's a little just some intellectual argument, but it feels that way. Pieces, every time I read a piece, often when I read a piece on the fly, there'll be edits that I'll make as I say them. You know, I won't read exactly what's on the page
Right.
because
Well, then,
I get a new idea and I fly with it.
right.
It might be small, or
What is, you think, is there a balance between the intuitive and the intellectual?
sometimes there's a balance. Sometimes there's an out of balance. I don't know. I find when I'm particularly in that writing new, just letting the hand go, the ink, just trying to get out of the way and letting it out. There's aesthetic may be the closest word, but I'll measure it in some ways and decide. I mean, after I'll be there presently, not doing anything except just letting it out, and then they'll be like, or, eh, you know, and that's like kind of maybe the aesthetic, and maybe that's the intellectual, and the writing of it is the intuitive. I think a lot of it is like left brain, right brain kind of stuff. Like, and I think,
I've heard several people say that they almost have a different persona as their critic. They
yeah,
sort of
yeah,
finish their creative process and then invite the critic in
right,
to.
right. I think Pamela, who you mentioned talking about, speaking with, she talks about the accountant in the basement. Like, he belongs in the basement. Occasionally, you run the books by him, but basically keep him in the basement. And maybe it's not the accountant, maybe it's the bookkeeper or whatever.
Right.
But I read a lot when I was in college. I read some Rollo May. I don't know if you know him, but he's a philosopher, psychologist, and I think he had a book out called Love and Will, I think is the name of the book, and had this wonderful description of the making of art as a process of kind of descending into a demonic kind of, nearly psychotic state, and bringing something back from that. And I think that's kind of, to some extent, how I find my writing to actually, when I can come up with stuff that's good, it is kind of getting into this almost trancy delirium where the job is almost to slow your mind down enough so that you can get your hand to keep up, and and then later, evaluate, or kind of, trim, or see, I don't know, measure it somehow, or
Bring in the practical valuations.
yeah, I mean, you'd like it to be spelled correctly, that kind of thing,
Or not, but
or
you
not,
want
yeah, but by
but when
choice.
you want it
Right,
to.
right, when you want it to be spelled correctly. Um, but I think it's left and right brain kind of is what's
Uh-huh.
going on to
Yeah.
some extent, and that there's this sort of like razor of sort of dancing like a tightrope walker between that sort of emotional brain and that sort of rational brain.
Yeah. Are you interested in writing a play yourself?
Uh, I'm interested in it, but I'm a little afraid of that. I've done some work on a novel, and I'm still very interested in continuing to write poetry. But maybe that's just because I'm a little afraid of the longer work. The consistency of character, story, and I don't know if I've quite got my skills to that level yet, or something. Or maybe I'm afraid that I don't have my skills to that level, and so I've backed off from really putting the time in to those projects. Although I'm putting in numerous amount of hours and time that, but to put to different poems and stuff, it somehow
Yeah.
seems easier and seems a little freer and
Well, there's something really gratifying about a poem because it's doable. You can get it done
uh-huh.
in the foreseeable future,
Yeah.
which is nice.
Yeah, and it's a little scary to think about a novel's going to take a year, or maybe some people get novels done in less, but I know some people take a lot longer.
Well, there is, I've met a couple of writers who are process oriented, who once they set up the process, they just march through and it is what it is.
Right.
And when it's done,
Mm-hmm.
it could be 10 days, 10
Mm-hmm.
weeks, or 10 months,
Mm-hmm.
but they're faithful to the process. I can never quite. I mean, I love a good
Sounds like a
process.
Kostabi.
I love a good process myself, but I could not like completely be faithful to it.
Yeah, I at least, I mean, I have a ritual of writing in the morning, or using that morning time as a artistic time. Right now, it's learning a part, but I wouldn't call it a process. I mean, not in an
No,
algorithmic
no, that's not. No,
comp sci.
the kind of process I was speaking of was sort of the antithesis of that.
Yeah,
That's where
exactly.
you allow a mechanical function
Right.
to define.
The art factory
Right, right,
of Herr Warhol.
right.
Not that, I mean, there were some wonderful things out of that. Just I worked on a poem. I've worked on a few poems which were dialogue poems between he, she, or you know. In fact, one of my cards, we spoke the same language, we just spoke it differently. And I have a poem called "Slow Number," which kind of like a guy says something, and a female voice, you know, completely misinterprets basically what he said, and there's just a series of misunderstandings based on double meanings of words, or you know, I like the way you dance, I hurt my leg, you know, kind of silliness, really. Um, well, it certainly can be done. That's one of the great things about poetry or writing, in terms of as a medium. It's uh,
Did you?
anything's possible, really, because it's not constrained. That's why plays, I think, are harder, or maybe easier, because the constraints of either a play or a screenplay, the constraints of where it's ultimately going to be presented is subjected to, there are certain constraints operating.
Yeah.
Whereas, like in a novel or a poem, even more so, you can go anywhere, really. You know?
Do you ever collaborate on poetry?
Not really. I mean, I've done.
Seems to be pretty much of an individual, personal.
Yeah, I mean, I've played Exquisite Corpse, and that's that game where you write a sentence and leave the last word off, or you write the last word on the next line, and then the person, or some series where you leave the last sentence exposed. Somebody writes the next sentence, fold it over. I've played that game, but I don't think that's not really collaborating as sort of sequencing fragments over a group. Collaborating, I mean, ultimately, to some extent, art is not. I don't see really even it
Yeah,
can be
I had.
collaborating is sort of one thing, and mixing together is another.
Yeah.
And I think certainly you can mix things together, but to really say that it's collaborative, I'm not sure if it really is. Maybe in performance, because acting is reacting, then it becomes more truly
Right.
collaborative.
Now, I guess poetry. Speaking of performance,
Yeah.
In poetry, does your audience enter into the process sometime? I'm talking about that early morning process.
Well, I think that to some extent that's exactly what you don't want to do, because it then you're putting it outside yourself, and you're guessing what they want, what you're guessing what it's. I think um, you're putting a layer between yourself and, I think, where you'll find the real, true, good stuff.
Right.
It's like trying to write a hit single. I mean, people do it, I guess, but
Yeah.
I don't think that's not what really I'm interested in.
No, I sort of have this image of a Tin Pan Alley guy with a cigar who sits down at a desk and writes a hit single, but I'm not sure if that's really, if
Well, there
anyone
was that,
really does that.
right. Well, there was that period, I guess, that like Carole King and that whole group of songwriters were all in this one building I forgot the name of the building, but it was a famous building in the.
Tower of Song.
Yeah, yeah, Leonard Cohen's line. But no, it was a famous building where people just went to work and cranked out songs. Just were cranking out songs that were, hit songs. And it was like a 9 to 5 crank out song kind of thing. But I think ultimately that was just sort of the box that they were working in. Ultimately, to really write, you still have to
Actually,
kind of
that
get back
that
into.
could be interesting for, 3 weeks.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly nice to get compensated and acknowledged. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think if you start writing for that,
Right,
then you kill it.
right.
It kind of has
Well, I
to
guess
happen.
that's the difference between art and industry, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't know.
Poetry's not part of an industry yet, is it?
There was a time, Walt Whitman was a superstar in his day. I guess Ginsberg was the last superstar we've had. But even he had to teach to really survive. I don't know, maybe, with the slam scene, with hip hop kind of crossing over with that, there's the spoken word is kind of, to some extent, making it into the mega, the media, the high level media level that compensates out of proportion, really. But it seems like to some extent it's all or nothing these days.
Well, not
Like
for poets. For poets, it's, you better
basically
go in.
nothing.
You're right, it's nothing.
Well, I know, but yeah, that's.
Nothing, and if you get lucky, it's nothing.
Well, and yeah, that's probably pretty much true. I mean,
Except for the poetry, you do get the poetry,
you do get the poetry.
and that's guaranteed.
Well, I think our most important and desperate endeavor is to put meaning in our lives, and if making art does nothing else, I think it does put meaning in our lives, and so poetry does that. It's been doing that for me, and for many people, I think. Um, and there's certainly it's about sharing it and feeling like you're being understood.
I have a friend passing through.
Oh wow, indeed, a doe.
Yeah.
Um, poet says deer.
Just as
Yeah.
creatures sort of foraging for little bits
For the
of
the distilled
nature or something.
moments. Yeah, I mean, well, you have to be a good listener, I think, to be a good poet,
Uh huh.
and there's a certain degree of uh, non-assertiveness to some extent, and it's, I think, to some extent about the observation skills that you have rather than the sort of some force of vision. It's more about a capability rather than ability. Like you're capable
So
to receive rather
actually,
than...
it's more of a process of discovery
I
than
think so.
invention.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's that sort of invention of language but it's a discovery process. Yeah, I think it feels that way. I think Dylan was one who said he felt he hadn't written any of the songs he's written, and he just kind of, they were floating around, and he just kind of, they bumped him on the head, you know. And that's why that morning time is really good for that, because you kind of, I think you're more available for the things to kind of float in,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in a sort of,
Yeah.
in a
Well, what about that trance state? Is that something that at a certain point is self-induced, or do you just...
well, I think yeah, I think it's a getting to a place where you're willing to receive, kind of.
Well, one of the interesting parallels that I've been working with is the shamanic concept of the spirit world.
Hmm.
Of course, they see the spirit world as an absolute reality, as an absolute place
Right.
where something is happening, where writers, artists seem to, allow it to be a metaphorical place or something. So,
Hmm.
how do you feel about that? Does it feel like more of a real place or sort of a metaphorical place?
I don't know. But I don't know if I don't know if I need to know. I mean, more involved with just going there or being there
Right,
when I'm writing. I mean, and
right.
whether I'm channeling, you know, Tennyson or
Right.
not, I don't know, but
Doesn't
it
matter.
doesn't really. I mean, because it's not even. That's more like I'd be guessing anyway.
Right,
What the fuck do I know?
right.
Um,
So really
I mean,
it's
as far as my belief, I probably do not believe that I'm channeling some other poet or visiting a spirit world, but I'm in a place of being available for things arriving. And whether they're arriving from, you know, some deeper region of my brain, or whether they're arriving from, you know, a spirit cloud or this tree, or I think it happens in the open between us as sort of, you know, rational being and the complex of rational, reasonable, emotional, irrational, and the world. And there's some this sort of magical thing. I think Heidegger kind of concept about the open. And like you go into the open and you bring back something, and that makes us gods. You know, that's being a god, really, is to... And that's kind of what it's about. Somehow it's about uh, going someplace, a state, internal, external, someplace, almost it's unnameable by its nature, and
mm,
bringing something back, or being given something and returning with it on your shoulder, or in your pocket, or on your under your tongue, and it's sort of like a visiting, or
actually this process probably hasn't changed much.
right. I think, you know, I say the cave painters, you know, they go to the hunt, but they go. It's not really the hunt that they actually did. It's sort of this mythicized hunt, and they bring it back and they put it up on the wall, you know, and suddenly, you know, they've done something more than just, you know, more than just
A record.
a record. It's more than a record. It's a storytelling, and they put it in the open, being a place that's open to you and open to them, and it's out there in the middle, and it's
That storytelling, telling the story in that way is actually sort of a very hopeful process, isn't it?
yeah, I think so,
Sort of
because
seeking a connection.
yeah, absolutely. I think that's why we speak, why we make art, is to you know uh, to share, to connect, to to sort of, for a moment, prove we're not alone, prove that there's some of me in you and there's some of you in me,